Before my life spun out of control, I found comfort in my simple routines, working on the house, kicking back with a beer, and playing hockey with the guys. My wife Hannah and I had a stable life, not without its struggles, but it worked. When odd things started happening, missed calls, last-minute excuses for late nights, I brushed them off, thinking it was just work stress. Over time, her work trips picked up. She grew distant, her attention drifting elsewhere. I had a gut feeling something was wrong, but I ignored it. Then one winter night, a call shattered everything. Hannah was on a 2-week work trip to Houston, so I settled in to watch war movies alone. Midway through Band of Brothers, my phone rang. I thought it was my buddy Adam, but instead, a woman's voice came through. "Detective Collins from Vale," she said, going on to explain that Hannah had been in a serious accident and was in the hospital. I was dumbfounded. Hannah was supposed to be in Houston. I'd planned my weekend around movies and snacks. The last thing on my mind was a call saying she was anywhere but Texas. Seeing unknown on the caller ID, I assumed it was Adam and picked up, annoyed, only to be thrown by the woman's calm voice. She repeated that Hannah was hurt in Vale, but I insisted she was hundreds of miles away. When the detective read Hannah's home address from her ID, I went quiet. It was beginning to dawn on me that something wasn't right. My mind raced on the 2-hour drive to Vale. Maybe someone stole her purse, or maybe it was actually Hannah. But why would she be there? A nagging voice in my head reminded me I hadn't watched her get on the plane. Could she be cheating? I told myself then and there. If she was unfaithful, I'd leave her. I wasn't going to let a cheater stay in my life. Ending a 10-year marriage wasn't something I took lightly, but I couldn't end up like my father. When I was 10, I watched him fall apart as my mom got closer to friends, and he grew suspicious. One night, I overheard her admit she was cheating. They tried to patch things up, but my dad became so controlling it practically smothered her. They divorced after I graduated, and Dad was never the same. I rarely talked to my mom. I still feel like her choices broke him. I wasn't going to follow in his footsteps, or my brother Marcus's, who snapped and went to prison after catching his wife cheating. If Hannah betrayed me, I'd deal with it on my own terms. As I got closer to Vale, my anxiety sank deeper. Even my inner voice went quiet. When I finally got to the hospital, parking felt like the last thing holding me together. I hadn't had anything stronger than a beer in years, but right then, I craved a bottle of Jack. Inside, I explained to the front desk why I was there, and they pointed me to her room. When I reached the floor, I realized I was in the ICU. A short, blonde nurse approached, her uniform straining as she said, "Your wife is sedated." It hit me. If this is even her, but I stayed silent. She added, "She's in rough shape and won't look like herself. She can't hear you, but be ready." My nerves were frayed, but I nodded. "Let me in," I said, trying to steady my voice. The sight on the bed took my breath away. The woman was breathing, chest rising and falling, and while her body looked like Hannah's, her face was swollen beyond recognition. What did she do? Hit every tree on the mountain? I muttered. The nurse shook her head. No, she didn't ski. She was found hurt this morning. That choice of words had me raising an eyebrow. Faithful wives don't end up here in this state, abandoned. My inner voice nagged. I looked at the nurse, uncertain, and told her I wasn't sure this was Hannah. She pulled back the blanket, revealing the woman's left thigh. There it was, Lucky Star, tattooed on her inner thigh. Hannah had gotten it right before our wedding, saying it symbolized her parents, Tom and Nina. That tattoo confirmed it. This broken woman was Hannah. I'd only seen her in this much pain once before, the night we met. It was after a Tool concert. My buddies and I had stocked the van with beer for the after-party, and Hannah came over asking for one for her boyfriend. My friend Luke laughed and said, "You can stay and have a drink, but we're not giving him one." She stormed off, but minutes later, I heard yelling. When I got there, she was getting shoved by a short, angry guy, clearly overcompensating for something. He was shouting, "Where's my beer, you witch?" while hitting her. No one else stepped in, so I grabbed him by the collar and yanked him away. He tried to intimidate me, but I wasn't having it. When he took another swing at her, I knocked him out and helped her back to our van, where Luke was waiting with an ice pack. Security showed up and took the guy away. I wanted to report him, but she stopped me, saying, "You've done enough. No one stands up to Logan. He'll probably go back to Wyoming now." Even with her messy makeup and that goth look, she was striking. We dropped her off, and on the ride back, Luke elbowed me and said, "I think she likes you." I brushed it off, but the next day, I found a note in the van. "Call me, Hannah." 2 days later, I called her. She sounded surprised but happy, and we ended up talking for an hour. That evening, she called me back, and we talked late into the night. By Friday, we had a date set, a cozy Italian restaurant for dinner, followed by drinks and dancing. When I walked her to her door, she gave me a smirk and asked, "Are you just trying to get me into bed?" I laughed and told her, "I'd rather wait a few dates. Makes things interesting." I gave her a quick kiss on the cheek and left, leaving her curious. For a few weeks, our schedules barely lined up. We'd catch each other on the phone, but it was always a quick conversation. Finally, we set aside a weekend to meet, but her aunt passed away, and she had to fly to Florida for the funeral. The weekend after she returned, we finally went to a movie, and when I picked her up, her dad, Tom, met me at the door. He was friendly enough, asked me a few questions, then his tone shifted. "You're a better fit for Hannah than that other loser," he muttered. I shrugged, saying, "He met me. Hopefully, he stays gone." Tom agreed, muttering about Logan as Hannah came down the stairs, looking so good in her dress it made me rethink my 3-date rule. But we didn't sleep together that night. She had to work early the next morning, so we kept it simple. The next weekend, we planned another date, but halfway through, she suddenly had stomach cramps. My place was nearby, so I took her there to rest. She went to the bathroom, and I thought that was it. But when she came back, she was wearing red underwear and high heels, saying, "Take off your coat." That night was one to remember. The next morning, we grabbed breakfast, and by Sunday night, we were having dinner again. As I dropped her off, she joked that I was her favorite guilty pleasure. Back in the present, as I left the hospital, the nurse handed me Hannah's personal belongings and mentioned the police had already gone through them. As I stood there trying to process everything, her phone rang. The nurse passed it to me. It was Detective Collins, asking me to come down to the station for questioning. I agreed, though a nervous edge was creeping in. Part of me wondered if they thought I'd hurt Hannah. Why would I do that? I thought, though another voice whispered, "Because she betrayed you?" I didn't have solid proof of her cheating, but her being in Vail instead of Houston made me suspicious. Maybe she'd won a trip, flown into Denver, rented a car, and wound up in trouble. But it all seemed too convenient, too strange. When I arrived at the station, the sun was setting, casting long shadows over everything. Detective Collins met me in the lobby with Deputy Devon, a tall guy who looked at me like he was already sure of my guilt. I asked if I needed a lawyer, and Collins responded, "Do you think you need one?" I said no, feeling uneasy, but I had nothing to hide. She led me to a small interview room, gesturing for me to sit. "I'm going to record this conversation, Mr. Lewis," she said. "Is that okay?" "Fine by me," I replied. Trying to lighten the air, I added, "Sorry about calling you a prick on the phone. I thought you were my friend interrupting my downtime." She tilted her head. "Your downtime?" I shrugged. "Yeah, I watch World War II movies when Hannah's out of town. She hates them." Just then, Devon came in and sat beside her. "Ready?" he asked, and Collins pressed the record button. "For the record," she began, "this is Detective Rachel Collins interviewing Mr. Samuel Lewis regarding case 1256G, involving Hannah Marie Lewis. Mr. Lewis, please state your name, age, and date of birth." I straightened up. "My name is Samuel Elijah Lewis. I'm 35, born December 16th. She nodded, asking for my address and occupation, and I told her, 1467 West Danube Avenue, Colorado Springs. "I'm a bricklayer." "Where were you between 6 p.m. last night and 8 a.m. this morning?" she asked, watching me closely. I thought back carefully. I was in Manitou Springs from 9 to 7, repairing a fireplace. Then I drove to Larry's bar and stayed there until about 11. Got home around 11:30 and stayed there until you called. Collins asked if anyone could confirm this. I nodded. Ruth Evans in Manitou can vouch for my work, and Adam Montgomery saw me at Larry's. My neighbor John Baker can confirm I was home around midnight, and again at 3 and 6 in the morning. Devin raised an eyebrow. How would he know that? We both walk our dogs late, so we usually cross paths, I explained. Collins and Devin exchanged glances, and she continued with the questioning. When did you last see your wife? Collins asked. Monday morning. I drove her to the airport for her flight to Houston. And why was she going there? For her company's annual meeting. It's a big deal. Only top performers get invited. This was her 3rd year, I explained. Collins asked what Hannah did for work, so I told them she sold life insurance for TransUnited, the kind that advertises with an old guy telling people to prepare for the inevitable. Both detectives nodded. Did you see her with her suitcase? Collins asked. Yes, at the airport, I replied. She almost forgot it, actually. We had to go back home because she thought I'd grabbed it when I warmed up the car. Collins continued, how often does she go on these trips? Twice a year. 2 weeks in February for a general meeting, and 2 weeks in August for training in Indianapolis. Is the February meeting always in Houston? No, last year it was in LA, and before that, New York. After a quick look at Devin, Collins asked, anyone who'd want to harm your wife? I shook my head. Not that I know of, though maybe some clients. The company's sales tactics aren't popular. People sign up for a free kids kit, and then Hannah delivers it to try to sell them insurance. It can be pretty annoying for some. Did she meet with clients in Vail? Collins asked. She was supposed to be in Houston, I sighed. Maybe her colleagues know why she wasn't. I handed over a list of her work contacts. Collins nodded. You're free to go, Mr. Lewis. Will you head home tonight? No, I'll find a motel, I replied. Driving back to the hospital, questions swirled. Less than a week ago, I dropped her off at the airport, and now she was in a Vail hospital. Once there, the staff told me visiting hours were over. The guard joked that if I wanted cheap lodging in Vail during ski season, I'd better have family nearby. I thanked him and walked to my car, looking through Hannah's belongings. One item caught my eye, a bottle of Percocet that hadn't been returned. Why would she still carry those pills? Then I noticed her boots, remembering she used to stash a keycard inside. Sure enough, there was one. But it was blank, with no identifying marks. A possible clue, but where was her phone? It wasn't in her purse or on the inventory list. Maybe it's still out there, I thought. My neighbor John had once created a phone tracking app after his partner kept misplacing his. I'd installed it on Hannah's phone ages ago. I opened the app, entered her number, and saw that I was 4 miles away from her phone. I followed the directions up the mountain to a ski resort, where I found Hannah's BMW among the luxury cars. Her phone was apparently in room 114. I tried the key card. Nothing. Moving up the floors, I finally got it to work on 314. Standing at the door, I hesitated. Should I call the cops or go in alone? I pressed my ear to the door but heard nothing, so I swiped the card and opened it. The room was dark, with only the hall light behind me. I turned on the light and glanced around. Something was off. The place looked staged, as if someone had tried to erase their tracks but hadn't done a great job. Hannah's suitcase was on the bed, neatly packed, her phone charging on the nightstand, and her laptop on a table near the window. Too clean, I thought. The bed was made, but the quilt was a little crooked, and the sheets underneath looked slept in. In the bathroom, there were wet spots on the sink and damp towels, as if someone tried cleaning up in a hurry. Back at the bed, I pulled back the blanket. The sheets were wrinkled, but there were no signs of anything violent, no blood or torn fabric. What happened here? I sat down and picked up Hannah's phone. She never used passwords, so I unlocked it easily. Her laptop took a moment to boot, so I called my sister Sarah to ask if she could look after my dog. Then, I made the harder call to Hannah's father, Tom, and explained what little I knew. I hope this is just some misunderstanding, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. Tom let out a long sigh. Call me if you find out anything. Next, I contacted my cousin Peter, a detective, and asked him to get in touch with the Vail police. He agreed, saying he'd keep me updated. I took one more step and called the lodge's front desk, asking if a Hannah Lewis or Joey McIntyre was registered. They said they had no one by either name. When Hannah's laptop finally booted up, I noticed her browser history and emails were wiped clean. A strange detail, considering she never deleted anything. I checked her phone too. All her texts were gone. Someone's definitely covering their tracks, I thought. I opened Hannah's suitcase, finding one business suit, 3 cocktail dresses, and plenty of lingerie. This isn't a business trip wardrobe, I realized. Divorce felt inevitable. The next morning, after a restless night sitting by the table, I showered, grabbed Hannah's phone and laptop, and left her suitcase untouched. After some coffee, I called Detective Collins to report the keycard I'd found. We arranged to meet at the station. When I arrived, Collins looked me over and said sympathetically, "You look like a man whose world has collapsed." "I think I'll lose my wife over this," I replied, trying to hold myself together. I'd like to hear her explanation, but I doubt I'd believe it. "Don't lose hope yet," she offered, though her expression wasn't reassuring. I thanked her and went to the hospital, where I was granted 15 minutes with Hannah every 2 hours. During one visit, I stared at her, hoping she'd wake up and give me answers. Dr. Clark interrupted my thoughts, explaining Hannah was recovering but suggested transferring her to Denver for rehab. He mentioned possible brain damage, but all I could focus on was the uncertainty of her betrayal. I signed the transfer papers, and after confirming I could handle the rest at St. Luke's on my way home, the doctor returned with a change of plans. "We'll send her to St. Augustine's in Colorado Springs. It'll be easier for your family to visit," he said. After a final visit, I left the hospital with tears in my eyes. At least crying in a hospital's normal, I thought. Anywhere else, people would stare. I called Hannah's dad, Tom, and updated him. When I arrived home, I saw my sister Sarah's Jeep in the driveway. Piper, my Doberman, greeted me at the door, and Sarah was there, waiting. She took one look at me, and I broke down, mourning my marriage's end. Sarah stayed late, trying to get me to eat, but my appetite was gone. Together, we went to tell Tom and Nina everything. As I explained, I watched Tom's expression shift from disbelief to resignation. He'd worn that look once before, during a rocky time in my relationship with Hannah. We'd been dating a few months when she suddenly canceled our weekend plans. Frustrated, I accepted it, but as I hung up, I overheard Tom in the background, yelling, "Tell that son of a witch he better come talk to me." Worried, I drove over, and Tom met me at the door, furious. "You're no better than that other prick," he spat. "If you're going to hurt my daughter, come at me." Confused, I replied, "Hurt her? What are you talking about?" Then Hannah and Nina appeared, and I saw Hannah had a black eye. Before I could ask, Tom shouted, "You hit her." Stunned, I looked at Hannah, who quickly corrected him. "He didn't touch me, Daddy. I was with Logan, and we argued." I was so hurt and angry. I told her we were done and drove aimlessly until I ended up at Logan's. When he answered the door with a smug grin, I punched him hard, then again and again, until he was on the ground. I noticed boxes around his trailer and asked, "Are you moving?" He muttered something, and I gave him one last kick. "Happy trip," I said before leaving. When I got home, icing my knuckles, the phone rang. Without checking the ID, I answered. It was Hannah, pleading, "Samuel, please." I hung up before she could finish. She kept calling, but I ignored her. After an hour, the calls finally stopped. Just as I was starting to relax, the phone rang again. Annoyed, I checked and saw it was my cousin Peter. "Hey, Elijah," he said, using my middle name, a family nickname. "What's up, Peter?" "Just a heads up. CSBD got a call that Logan Hernandez is in rough shape. Says some big guy beat him up. You wouldn't know anything about that, would you?" I laughed. "Nope, not a clue. But thanks for the warning. Be careful, Elijah. If anyone connects you to this, it could get messy." A day later, the police showed up, but I was prepared. I had my hockey gear laid out, and the scratches on my knuckles looked like they came from practice. Since I played for a police-sponsored team, the officer seemed satisfied with my story. The next day, I returned home to find several notes pinned to my door, mostly from Hannah, but one from Tom, apologizing for jumping to conclusions and asking me not to hold it against her. I called Tom, reassuring him, "It's okay. You reacted how any father would." "Thanks, son. Do you want to talk to Hannah?" I heard her pleading in the background, but I replied firmly, "No, Tom." She knew what Logan was like. and she let you believe I hit her. She canceled our plans just so I wouldn't see her face. I understand, Tom said, disappointed. I'm sorry, but I can't tolerate a cheater, I replied. As I finished explaining everything to Tom and Nina, I saw Tom recalling the past. I'm glad they transferred her here, son, but I hope you're not planning anything drastic. No, sir, I assured him. I'm not hiring lawyers yet, but Hannah owes me a serious explanation. Whatever happens, Samuel, he said, Nina and I still think of you as family. We hope you won't cut us out. I promised I wouldn't, though it was hard to imagine where things would go from here. On the drive home, Sarah asked, Are you going to be okay? Do I have a choice? I sighed. I'm not giving up, but if she cheated, that's it. I won't become one of those paranoid husbands who tracks her every move. Sarah sighed. Mom's worried about you. Maybe you should talk to her. I shook my head. So she can tell me cheating's normal? No thanks. Sarah had been pushing me to reconnect with Mom, especially after our brother Marcus went to prison. But after she defended his actions, I couldn't accept her view. Sarah nodded but warned, Just make sure you have the facts first. I assured her I would. Later, I stopped by my friends John and Nick's place. John took Hannah's laptop, promising to dig around. Nick, trying to lighten things, offered to set me up with his cousin. I laughed, and we shared a beer while John went to work on the laptop. When Nick headed off to bed, he teased, I'll be dreaming about your sexy newly single neighbor. I rolled my eyes, grinning. After I left, I played a quick game of fetch with Piper, my Doberman. Hannah hated Piper sleeping on the bed, but that night, I didn't care. The next morning, I killed time with the sports section until 9 a.m., then went to see Hannah's boss, Donnie Fox. What can I do for you, Kevin? He asked cheerfully, still mixing up my name. Ignoring it, I asked, Why would my wife leave a Houston convention to go to Vail? Donnie looked surprised. I didn't send her to Houston. That meeting was for new agents, not managers like Hannah. I could feel irritation building. And the training in Indianapolis? How long are those? Just a few days. Sunday to Thursday, he replied, uncomfortably. So she's been taking extra time for herself? Donnie hesitated. Sometimes people make choices that don't make sense to us, he said, avoiding my gaze. Who was she with, Donnie? I demanded. He sighed. Promise me you won't hurt anyone. Your wife is in a coma, so if I know anything, it's only for your peace of mind. With cold restraint, I replied, Just tell me. He finally gave me a name, and my heart sank. It was the last person I'd ever want to be involved. An hour later, my cousin Peter called. We found out who rented the room Hannah was staying in. He's agreed to come in for questioning. Can I be there when you talk to him? I asked. I'll call you when it's set up, Peter promised. I spent the afternoon meeting with Hannah's medical team. Part of me wanted to walk away, but I knew I didn't have all the answers yet. Tom and Nina arrived an hour before Hannah's transfer from Vail, and I told them everything I'd learned. Tom was stunned, and Nina begged me to hold off on any final decisions. I promised I wouldn't act rashly, but I couldn't guarantee anything. Tom looked at me with concern. Can you handle this, son? I was honest. I don't know. I can't trust her now, and I've seen what mistrust did to my dad. I don't want to end up like him. Nina, hopeful, said, But you've forgiven her before. Back then, we weren't married, and it wasn't this serious. And she wasn't lying like this, I replied. The memory of a previous fight came back to me. After dating a few months, Hannah had canceled our weekend plans last minute. Annoyed, I'd accepted it, but I'd overheard Tom yelling, Tell that son of a witch he better come talk to me. Worried, I drove over, only to have Tom meet me at the door, furious. You're no better than that other loser. If you're going to hurt my daughter, face me, he shouted. Confused, I asked, What are you talking about? Then Hannah and her mom came out, and I saw Hannah's black eye. Before I could ask, Tom accused, You hit her. Stunned, I looked at Hannah, who quickly intervened. He didn't touch me, Daddy. I was with Logan, and we argued. Angry and hurt, I walked away, telling her we were done. Driving aimlessly, I found myself at Logan's trailer. When he opened the door with a smug grin, I punched him, then hit him again until he crumpled to the floor. Seeing moving boxes around, I asked, "Are you leaving?" He mumbled a response, and I gave him one last kick. "Safe trip," I said, walking away. At home, I iced my knuckles when the phone rang. Without checking, I answered. Hannah was on the line, pleading, "Samuel, please." I hung up before she could finish. She kept calling, but I ignored it. After an hour, the ringing finally stopped, only to start again a few minutes later. Annoyed, I checked the ID. It was my cousin, Peter. "Hey, Elijah," he said, using my middle name, a family nickname. "What's up, Peter?" CSBD got a call that Logan Hernandez was assaulted. He says some big guy beat him up. You wouldn't know anything, would you? I laughed. Nope, not a clue. But thanks for the heads up. Just be careful, Elijah. If they connect this to you, it could get messy. The next day, an officer showed up at my door, but I was prepared. I'd set out my hockey gear, and my scraped knuckles looked like they'd come from practice. Since I played on a police-sponsored team, the officer seemed satisfied. Later, I came home to find several notes pinned to my door, most from Hannah, but one from Tom, apologizing for assuming the worst and asking me not to hold it against her. I called Tom and reassured him. "You reacted like any father would," I said. "Thanks, son. Do you want to talk to Hannah?" I could hear her pleading in the background, but I replied firmly, "No, Tom. She let you think I hurt her just to cover her own mistakes. I'm just mad I didn't see things clearly sooner," I told Hannah, tossing my gear aside. "We had good times, but you seem to prefer guys who can't handle their issues and then take them out on you." "Fine. I'm done." Tears streamed down Hannah's face. "I'm sorry, Samuel. I should never have let my dad think you hurt me." Her voice broke, but I stayed quiet. "I canceled our date so you wouldn't do something that would get you in trouble. I want to see Logan without telling you, and I left my phone at home so you wouldn't worry." "You don't owe me an explanation, Hannah," I replied, my voice cold. "I'm done." "No," she insisted, standing her ground. "You need to hear this. I want to see Logan because he was moving to Wyoming. When I told him I wasn't coming with him, he lost it and hit me. I hid at Megan's for a while, but by the time I got home, my dad had already seen me, and you know the rest." I stood there for a long moment, absorbing her words. She looked shattered, remorseful. After a beat, I finally sighed. "Fine." I listened. "Now, I have a shower waiting." I don't know why I asked, but I found myself saying, "Do you want to join me?" She didn't need to be asked twice. That night, we decided to be exclusive. 3 weeks later, she moved in, and 8 months after that, we were married. The only time Logan came up again was when she told me he died in a car accident in Wyoming. I remember she seemed sad but relieved, and she went to his funeral to say goodbye. Now, a decade later, Hannah was being transferred to St. Augustine's ICU, with doctors cautiously optimistic about her recovery. I lingered in the hospital waiting area when a text from my cousin Peter interrupted my thoughts. He told me that Eric Grant, Hannah's longtime mentor, would be interviewed at 4 a.m. I glanced over at Tom and Nina, sitting nearby, and told them I had an appointment I needed to keep. At home, I pulled out a suit and tie, knowing Sheriff Roy Montgomery would expect a certain level of professionalism for the interrogation. Dressed and prepared, I arrived at the sheriff's office, where Peter met me with a warning. "You'll be out of view, and you can't say a word," he said. "If you speak, it could jeopardize the case." "I get it," I replied, meeting his gaze. "I won't say a word, and I won't attack him either." Inside, Sheriff Roy greeted me with a grin. "Been waiting to do this," he said, pulling out a badge and formally deputizing me so I could stay in the room as law enforcement. He gave me a brief hug afterward. "Your dad was a great cop, Samuel. I know you'd be one too, if you'd ever finished that degree." I couldn't help but smile, though my mind drifted to old memories. On our way to the interrogation room, I noticed Michelle Taylor, my high school crush, passing by. Still just as stunning as I remembered, though I quickly dismissed the thought. She was probably like the rest, I figured. Seemed cheating was a pattern in my life, almost a curse in my family. Even my brother Marcus would agree. Once we were set up, a deputy escorted Eric Grant into the room. Slick and self-assured, he had that salesman's look, always smiling, even in a room full of cops. I'd never met him, but I knew his face well enough from Hannah's stories and photos. He'd been her mentor, but apparently, he was a lot more than that. Peter introduced everyone, including Detective Collins and her partner Detective James from Vale, who joined us by video. Then, they got right into the routine questions, setting the stage. Eric answered easily, almost too comfortably, until Collins asked him about his weekend whereabouts. That's when I saw his confidence flicker. "Can I tell you something off the record?" he asked, looking nervous for the first time. His hands, which had been resting casually on the table, started to fidget. "Without my wife finding out?" It didn't take long for Eric to confess. He admitted to a 6-year affair with Hannah, a secret he'd kept from everyone except, apparently, his wife. "We just connected," he said, his face falling as he realized the seriousness of what he was admitting. He looked genuinely shaken when he learned that Hannah was in the hospital, as if he hadn't known just how badly things had escalated. He explained how they'd driven to Denver on Friday, planning a weekend together. According to Eric, Hannah had told him she'd want a trip to Vale, so he dropped her off at the airport. She'd even called me, apparently, while he was right there with her. After that, he claimed he went home, where his wife could verify he'd spent the weekend. When the questioning ended, Eric asked if he could speak with me privately. I agreed, not sure why, but feeling like I needed to hear whatever he had to say. Alone, he looked like a different man, deflated, remorseful, a shadow of the confident, smooth-talking mentor I'd heard about for years. "Samuel, you know who I am, right?" he started, his voice cautious. "Obviously," I replied coolly. "And you seem to know me too." He nodded. "Hannah keeps your photo on her desk and in her presentation kit. She loves you, you know." I scoffed. "No, she doesn't, or we wouldn't be here. Whatever you had with her, it doesn't involve love." "She does love you," he insisted. "I love her too. And my wife. She knows about my feelings for Hannah. She understands." "Is that right?" I replied sarcastically, feeling my anger simmer. "So this isn't just some cheap fling, then?" "No," he said quietly, a genuine sadness in his voice. "Hannah and I had something real. It started when I interviewed her for my team. We had chemistry from the start, and one day, after a no-show client, we grabbed lunch near a military base and ended up together at a nearby hotel. We both felt guilty afterward, but we couldn't ignore it. There was something real between us, Samuel. Not real enough to stop, apparently." I shot back, my voice thick with sarcasm. "Glad I didn't insult your precious little love story." Eric's face fell. "I understand your anger," he said, almost apologetic. "But I don't regret loving Hannah, not one bit." I couldn't believe the audacity. This guy was talking about his affair with my wife like it was some kind of epic romance. Part of me wanted to punch him right then and there, but I held back. I'd promised Peter I'd keep calm, and frankly, Hannah wasn't my problem anymore. "So, you don't mind your wife running off with someone else twice a year?" I asked Eric, my frustration clear. Eric sighed, looking defeated. "It's been hard enough sharing her with you. You can have her now." I stared at him, dumbfounded. "Sharing? Are you serious?" I didn't even know I was sharing her. If I had, we wouldn't have been together. I don't tolerate cheating. He nodded sadly. "That's why we had our system. You two had your trips to places like Mexico City, San Diego, and Rio. Hannah and I went to Miami, Vale, and other places. We'd spend 1 week together, then go back to our spouses." Anger flared in my chest. Hannah was gone for 2 weeks, and I only knew about Miami. So where was she the rest of the time? Eric looked genuinely stricken and even started tearing up. Did she cheat on me, too? I couldn't take any more of his pity party. "Goodbye, Eric. She's at St. Augustine's Hospital, room 2410. Tell her dad I'll be in touch." As I turned to leave, he called after me, "You're not going to tell my wife, are you?" I shot him a look. "I don't even know your wife. Why would I hurt her? The guilt will eat you alive. Have fun with that." I left him standing there. Outside, Peter was waiting. "Sorry, Elijah. I thought we had the guy." I shook my head, feeling the sting of betrayal. I knew he wasn't the one who hurt her, but how did this happen right under my nose? Just then, We heard a commotion down the hall. Eric's wife, Julia, was slapping him, her voice full of anger. "You cheating prick. Don't come home." As she passed me, she paused, hugging me, her shoulders trembling. "I'm so sorry," she whispered. "It's not your fault. We just married cheaters," I replied. She gave a sad laugh, wiping her eyes. "Good luck, Samuel," she said, kissing me on the cheek before walking away. I turned to Peter, shaking my head. He had that at home, and he still needed Hannah? Peter shrugged. Some guys just want what they can't have. We headed to Roy's office, where I returned my badge and listened to his usual lecture about becoming a cop. I'd heard it all before, but maybe one day I'd take him up on it. The next few days were intense. Tuesday, I found a lawyer to get things set for the divorce. Thankfully, Hannah and I didn't have kids, and Piper was mine. The house belonged to her grandmother, so there was no need to fight over it. I'd inherited my dad's house with my brother Marcus, and I was glad I didn't have to scramble for an apartment. Hannah had been angry when I insisted on keeping the house after Marcus's arrest, but I'd known it would be worth it. Now I was grateful. Late Tuesday, I went back to the hospital. Tom was there, and when he saw me, he just shook his head, his expression full of disbelief. "How long?" he asked quietly. 6 years, at least since she started selling insurance, I replied bitterly. But there could be more. Tom sighed heavily. "I can't believe my daughter did this." "Me neither. I wouldn't have married her if I'd known." I told him everything Eric had confessed, watching his face fall even more. "I always wondered why she stopped taking photos on her trips," Tom murmured, almost to himself. "She used to take pictures everywhere, even when she just went to Denver. Why didn't I notice?" Neither of us did. I told him I wouldn't be coming to the hospital anymore. "I can't see her again, Tom." Tom nodded. He asked if I'd stay at the house until Hannah recovered, and I agreed, promising not to file for divorce until she was stable. I'd miss Tom and Nina. They treated me like family, and it wasn't their fault they'd raised someone who betrayed us both. On Wednesday, I threw myself into work, spending the day repairing a chimney and then heading straight to hockey that evening. I played rough, my frustration spilling out onto the ice, and spent most of the first period in the penalty box. By the second period, after yet another penalty, the coach, who was a friend of my buddy Adam, pulled me from the game. He knew I was going through a rough time and didn't want me to get kicked out of the league. After the loss, I blamed myself, knowing I'd let personal problems bleed into my performance. Some teammates tried to reassure me, and a few even offered to handle Eric for me, though I probably didn't refuse clearly enough. After letting Piper out for a quick run, I was heading back inside when John called out. He was coming over with some news, and I guessed he'd found something on Hannah's laptop. The previous evening, I'd gone through all our bills and statements, but nothing suspicious came up. The only odd detail was that Hannah had been calling her friend Vera frequently before each trip, usually once a month, but more often as the trips approached. I tried calling Vera, hoping she'd have some answers, but I couldn't reach her. Part of me regretted not having Hannah's phone. It would have filled in some blanks. John arrived, looking eager. "What did you find?" I asked, grabbing a beer and sitting down with him at the bar. "Grab a drink, and I'll show you," he said, smirking. He opened Hannah's laptop. Whoever erased her data knew what they were doing. She has programs here that let her browse the internet without leaving a trace. "Hannah's no computer genius," I said, shaking my head. "She uses the same password for everything. Someone else set this up." John nodded. "Probably Vera. But check this out." He showed me that Hannah had hidden email and bank accounts. My eyes widened as he revealed the details. I also found a bunch of deleted love notes, some addressed to Eric, others to a Logan. I muttered a curse under my breath as John continued. He guided me to a hidden bank account with over $10,000. I arranged to transfer the funds to our joint account and close the secret account. Then, I changed all the contact information so I'd be notified of any further activity, determined to shut down whatever hidden life Hannah had been living. Later that evening, I called Detective Collins, even though it was late. I told her about Hannah's hidden bank account and the missing debit card, describing Logan and sharing the recent locations where the card had been used. Collins thanked me and said, "You know, Samuel, you'd make a decent cop." Ever think about it? I chuckled. I hear that a lot, I replied, wondering if I'd ever want that life. I'd seen enough of my dad's struggles as a cop to know it wasn't easy. The next morning, I took Piper out for a walk and ran into John. I asked if he still had DMV access, and with a grin, he promised to look into it. Finally, after a long night, I got some restless sleep, my mind still racing with questions. Later, Tom called to tell me the doctors thought Hannah would wake up soon. Have you thought about forgiving her? He asked gently. I could hear the hope in his voice, but I shook my head, even though he couldn't see me. No, Tom. I've uncovered too many lies, I replied, unwilling to tell him about the hidden bank account on top of the affairs. He was already devastated. That afternoon, John came over looking serious. You won't believe this, he said. Digging deeper, he'd found that Hannah hadn't entirely lied about going to Logan's funeral. She'd gone to Laramie for Vera's funeral, Logan's sister, and likely restarted their affair then. Things got worse from there. The year Hannah called me to join her in Miami, Logan was actually in jail for petty theft, his parole restricting him to Colorado. That explained why their meetups became more local after that. I was shocked but no longer surprised by anything Hannah had done. I called my lawyer to discuss my next moves, feeling a strange relief at finally knowing the full story. 2 weeks later, Hannah was awake and stable enough to be questioned by police. I followed Detective Collins and Detective James down the hospital hallway. Logan had been arrested in Denver, caught trying to withdraw cash with Hannah's stolen debit card. Security had detained him, and the Denver police arrested him. His parole officer was furious that Logan had left Denver without permission, which meant yet another violation. Peter managed to convince Collins and James to let me listen in on Hannah's questioning, but I agreed to stay out of view. Inside her hospital room, Hannah initially denied everything, putting on a face of innocence. Collins soon presented the evidence, revealing that hotel staff had seen her with both Eric and Logan. Cornered, she finally admitted to the affairs, looking humiliated as she recounted her relationship with Logan and her growing attraction to Eric. She tried to portray herself as conflicted, saying she'd felt guilt and had even arranged the Miami trip with me out of that guilt. Collins played an interesting angle, asking, "Your husband believes you had 2 lovers without his knowledge. What you say now might help him understand, maybe even reconcile." I almost scoffed. There was no chance of that, but Hannah took the bait and kept talking. She admitted she'd rekindled her relationship with Logan at his sister's funeral, claiming it was harmless to meet him monthly because it didn't hurt me. She explained her thrill of secrecy with Eric, how they met at company events and stole private moments together. Her casual lies, told without remorse, were enough to confirm I was done. Collins continued, asking Hannah to explain the bruises she'd suffered from Logan. She claimed he'd been furious when she stopped taking birth control to try for kids with me. When he realized she was committed to starting a family with me and not him, he'd lost his temper and lashed out. The tearful act she put on would have been worthy of an Oscar, but I stayed out of sight, clenching my fists to keep my calm. Finally, Collins asked one last question. "Why do you have Lucky Star tattooed on your thigh?" Hannah hesitated. "It was Logan's idea," she replied. "He said it would be a way for him to always be with me without Samuel knowing." That was enough. I stepped into the room, ignoring Hannah's look of surprise. She stammered, "Baby, I'm so sorry." I handed her the divorce papers, meeting her gaze. "No need. You've already been served." Without looking back, I walked out as her cries echoed down the hallway. 5 years later, my life was completely different. Late-night calls were now part of my job, and I had a wife who loved me and was expecting our first child. She murmured, "Be careful not to start something you can't finish," as I kissed her before heading to a new crime scene. Reflecting on how much had changed since my divorce, I remembered how complex the process had been. I'd assumed it would be simple, but Hannah fought every step of the way. My lawyer had discovered Hannah's hidden bank account, which opened up a new legal battle. Through a chance encounter with Eric Grant, I learned the money came from undeclared commissions and bonus checks, totaling over $120,000. With an accountant's help, I transferred $30,000 into our joint account and suggested we split everything equally. Hannah, however, wasn't satisfied. She demanded 75%, claiming she was being generous, by not taking half of the house I'd inherited from my dad. She wanted control, as always. After a fierce legal battle, we agreed to split the joint account down the middle, though she still took half of my business. It wasn't the outcome I'd wanted, but it was fair enough, and I was ready to move on. As I arrived at the trailer crime scene, I took a deep breath, feeling the weight of my past lift. My time with Hannah was behind me, and now I had the life I wanted with a family I could trust. I sold my share of the masonry business back to my uncle, took a receipt for $1, and went back to school to complete my criminal justice degree. Now I work for the El Paso County Sheriff's Department, far from the mess my marriage to Hannah had been. My lawyer kept everything legal, and with some creative accounting, we funneled Hannah's secret funds into our joint account. I paid the taxes, so Hannah unknowingly funded my education. She wore a smug smile when she got her settlement check, but I'm sure that faded when she saw her drained secret account. An anonymous tip to the IRS led to an audit. I was cleared, but Hannah wasn't, and she ended up serving 6 months for tax evasion. Ironically, Logan, caught with her bank card, was blamed for stealing her money and, due to his record, got 35 years for theft and parole violations. Julia divorced Eric, who moved to Utah to start over. After Hannah's release, she took a job at a telemarketing firm and sent me an angry letter blaming me for her misery. I tossed it, unfazed. When I told my buddy Adam about the letter, he joked I should have sold her to a brothel. She'd probably enjoy it, I replied. After 3 years as a patrol officer, I made detective. Domestic violence cases kept me busy, though the Colorado Springs Police Department handled most of the major crimes. The only time I had to pull my weapon was when a woman with a knife tried to attack me for arresting her abusive husband. Some cases were tragic. One involved a woman found beaten, her body surrounded by empty bottles. It seemed clear. Either her husband had killed her in a jealous rage, or an ex was involved. At least I knew my boss wouldn't push back on my work here. About a year and a half into my detective career, a new officer transferred in from the north, and one night at a nearby party, I was surprised to see Detective Rachel Collins. We got talking, and while some of the other detectives weren't thrilled about a patrol officer chatting with her, we quickly became friends. Even after learning she was single, I didn't pursue it. I was too jaded by relationships to complicate things. We'd go to dinner or catch a movie now and then, but I didn't see it as dating. One night, after a long case, we ended up at a bar. I stayed mostly sober to make sure she'd get home safely. When I helped her to her apartment, she asked me to take off her boots, then hugged me. She's drunk, Elijah, I thought. She's your best friend. Don't take advantage. I pulled back, but she looked at me with clear eyes, suddenly not so tipsy. Why don't you want me? She asked. What's wrong with me? Nothing's wrong, I said gently. First, you're drunk, and I don't want to ruin our friendship. Second, I have trust issues. After everything that happened, I'm just not ready. Did you enjoy kissing me? She pressed. Of course. You're one of the most beautiful women I know, I began, but she cut me off. Come with me. I'm not drunk, and I'm not some easy fling. I've only been with 4 guys, and you know all of them, she said. She admitted that she'd liked me since we met in Vail, and saw it as fate when I ended up working in law enforcement. That night marked the start of our relationship. A year later, we were married, and a month after, our first child arrived. My boss was less than thrilled about Rachel's maternity leave and constantly teased me about getting her pregnant. I used to joke with Peter that our son could be his godchild, though he wasn't amused. He also didn't appreciate that I took a month off for paternity leave, but I didn't care. Life had come full circle. Rachel, to my delight, shared my love for World War II movies, so movie nights at home felt like they were made just for us. Now I just hope Piper is okay with having both mom and dad around full-time. Somehow, I think she'll be just fine.